Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 4th annual UCFTI Expo. Please welcome to the stage Senior Vice President, Rogers & Cowan, Dennis Dembia.
女士们、先生们，欢迎莅临第4届美中影视产业博览会。现在，请欢迎 Rogers & Cowan 娱乐公关公司高级副总裁 Dennis Dembia 先生。
Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're the first panel of the day. It's good to see some people here and on time. I know it's a tough battle hitting the 10 and the 101, and some of you may have been celebrating a Dodger win last night late into the evening, so welcome. We've got a great panel this morning. We're talking about content and acquisitions, something that's very relevant now between the US and China, the two superpowers in the world of entertainment, really. And we're here to talk about how content works on both sides, the flow of content, the interaction, the collaboration for US content creators wanting to get their content acquired and distributed in China, and vice versa, how Chinese creators will like to or can take advantage of content being acquired and distributed in the United States. I want to introduce two of our panelists who are here now. We are waiting for one additional panelist who did get caught up in traffic this morning. He'll be joining us in 5 or 10 minutes. But I would like to introduce Paul Hansen, the CEO of Covert Media, and Gary Goldberger, who are part of this panel discussion today. They want to come up to the stage. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's talk about content. Content's a very broad subject. We're going to talk about kind of what works here and what works in China and why, and kind of the deal-making process. And we're very fortunate to have two real experts in this category who've been doing this for a long time and been very successful and are very knowledgeable about this space. And just to kind of open up the discussion, to spark this broadly, I wanted to kick things off with a comment that I read a couple weeks ago, a comment made by Jeffrey Katzenberg when he was talking about raising his $2 billion for his TV startup, and he addressed content. And what Mr. Katzenberg said was this, and it jumped out to me, and I want to see if you guys agree or disagree or why. He said, "We've all grown up with this idea that content is king, and I realized it actually isn't. Content is the kingmaker. It's not the king. The king is the platform. HBO is the king, Netflix is the king, Spotify is the king," end quote. Do you guys agree with that?
I would say at this sort of moment in time, or for periods of time, that is true. But I think if you take a long view, I would still take the position that content is king, in the sense that right now, in a world of substantial disruption in terms of technology and how content is consumed, in terms of different media platforms, we are in this very tumultuous period, and these first movers like Netflix have a huge impact on the industry, and as a result are sort of dictating what's happening. But if you look at it from the perspective of more of a 15 to 30-year time horizon, looking at history as well as I think we can guess as to what's going to happen in the future, there may be a new platform that then either competes with or eats up Netflix or takes away market share. And at the end of the day, if you're an owner or creator of content, not that you're agnostic about that, but that you survive regardless, and you're not competing on that level. And so you look at the core underlying assets of the studios that have been around for 80 or 100 years. They have survived for so long because they have the content, and obviously your methodology for exploitation and how you run that business might change a little bit, but the core asset is ultimately the content, and that's what matters. And I think as competition increases in some of these new media windows, the content owners will be the beneficiary. I think that the tricky thing about companies like Netflix is they are both. particularly Netflix, with spending their $8 billion a year now on content.
They announced that they will release 80 films next year.
Yes, that's a lot.
Content creators must love to hear something like that, right? If you're a content creator, are we in a golden age of content now with the fact that Netflix is putting out 80 Netflix originals and Amazon is doing what they're doing and with trying to equal them and Hulu and other platforms?
Well, I'll give my perspective. I'm sure Gary has, might have a different one. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword. It's great in terms of having big, well-funded buyers in terms of our ability to sell and partner with people to make content, and that's great. The downside is, I guess, twofold. One, Netflix wants the world in perpetuity and just the SVOD rights in large part for it to be on their platform, and so that's problematic in terms of the ecosystem. Sorry if you can't hear me as well. In terms of all the theatrical distributors, the television stations, et cetera, and then putting on our producer hat or financier hat, it changes the dynamic a little bit for talent as well, because they're paying premium prices for a lot of talent and keeping them busy for 8 months of the year on their series, and it's harder for us to compete and trying to make properly budgeted films ourselves.
That's a very good point. I've heard that echoed a lot, within the industry with other high-level producers and financiers. Thanks for sharing that key point. Gary, what is your thought on Mr. Katzenberg's comment?
I would respectfully disagree with Mr. Katzenberg, though he's got a lot more exposure and experience in that than I would have. But I always think that content is king. Without content, you can't get your name out there. Some examples that I would think of were with Netflix. Netflix was a company that rented videos and that sent you DVDs, and you would pay your monthly fee and you would watch them. And then Netflix decided we're going to try to bifurcate our distribution system, and we'll charge you one fee if you want to get hard copy DVDs and another fee if you want to stream. And the market reacted badly to that, and their stock went down. And then Netflix said, all right, we're going to try to make a big splash in original programming, and we're going to pay $110 or $112 million for this show that hasn't aired before. And the industry thought, boy, that's an awful lot of money they're paying for a show. And the show was House of Cards, and House of Cards became a big hit, critical and otherwise, for Netflix. And in many respects, it put them on a map as an original programmer. Another example is AMC. AMC was kind of a niche cable network. They had some shows that worked, they had some shows that didn't, and then they had The Walking Dead. And The Walking Dead has now helped brand AMC. So to me, content is king. Without content, and these days, not just content, but premium content, without that, it's really hard for an entity to get traction and get viewers, and with it, you can use it to help build your base and launch other shows, which I think is the end-all and be-all. The tricky thing these days is because of internet and new media, everybody can be a content creator. I can go in my garage and shoot something and put it up on the internet, and if you see it, you may like it just as much as you like the new Star Trek that CBS is going to put on their All Access and promote it. But the trick is, how do you find what I've put up there? So if you have premium content or content that hits with the public, that gives you not just branding for that show and for your channel, but also the ability to promote other content that might not get out there. So I respectfully disagree with the more knowledgeable Mr. Katzenberg on that.
And thank you. So maybe we can let William weigh in on this as well. First of all, welcome William Pfeiffer. He's the executive chairman and co-founder of Global Gate. Thank you for being here. I opened up this discussion about content and distribution by reading a quote that Jeffrey Katzenberg made a few weeks ago when trying to raise his $2 billion for his TV startup. And he said, we've all grown up with the idea that content is king, and then he realized it actually isn't. Content is the king maker. It's not the king. The king, he said, is the platform, HBO, Netflix, Spotify. How do you react to that statement? Do you agree, disagree?
I think that content is still king, and people go to the platforms to watch content and not just to be on a platform. The platforms are critical, however, for the business of content, and the bigger the platform, the better for the content makers. I think that as the platforms are expanding in the U.S. and globally, they have a lot more leverage in what kinds of content are being made and what kinds of deals are being struck. And if you look at China, where it's a very competitive market for content all the way around, and the streaming platforms, the online video platforms there are competing very heavily with each other. So it's in different markets, the situation's a bit different. There you've got a number of very strong platforms like iQIYI and Youtuber and others, and they are competing for the same content, so content makers are able to shop and to play them off of each other. So that now, a lot of these platforms are trying to initiate their own content and develop it themselves. Tencent is investing heavily into this area as well. They are able to, come to foreign production companies like ours and ask us to make series for them. They have their own development teams. But if you're out as a producer creating content and trying to figure out the way to maximize your dollar, you do go and play them off of each other. And I think that's still happening here in the U.S. as well. It's definitely happening here in the U.S. But it's the same kind of thing. So because of that, and to avoid the bidding wars, the platforms have developed their own very strong in-house production teams to try to create stuff so they don't have to go out and compete against everybody else. And so at the end of the day, content is still the king. I think that is what drives everything. The platforms are very important. They are certainly having leverage, but there's not only one platform, at least in the US and China, as of the focus. Certain other markets, there might be only one or two, and then the platforms are in a very strong position. But in the US, you still have multiple platforms. In China, you have several strong platforms. So, content is still the king.
Great. Thank you for weighing in on that. I think that's very relevant in today's ecosystem. Talking more specifically about content and talking about two gigantic markets, growing markets, but very different markets. Is there such a thing as a universal concept that can work in both China and the US? You read all the time, we're making films and TV series for a global audience, for a universal audience, a film or TV series with crossover appeal. Is that a reality? Could that be done?
It has been. It's hard. The trick, because I was, before having my law practice, I was involved in international distribution and co-productions and would talk to buyers from a lot of different countries about co-production projects. And the difficulty with programming that tries to appeal to more than one country is it has to really fit each country. And the idea of programming that works really well in the US, but maybe isn't that appropriate for China, but it has a big US star, doesn't really work and isn't fair to both countries. To make something that's attractive, you have to design it so that it appeals to China. And then you have to put on another hat and design it so that it appeals to the US. And then you have to hope that by doing so, you're not doing an injustice to the project. And that's very tough to do.
The Great Wall was supposed to be that one film that was
right.
going to achieve that.
Right. And so not only do you have to have elements that appeal to both markets, but you also have to make it a good film. It has to be a good, entertaining script, because if I'm sitting in China watching a movie and I don't like the movie, it doesn't matter that it has a big US star, and it doesn't matter that it may be about a Chinese historical event. And if I'm in the US, I don't care if it's about a Chinese historical event that I don't know anything about. I want it to be a good story. And ultimately, to me, again, it goes back to content being king. The story is king, but how do you craft a story that appeals to more than one country, particularly countries that have different sensibilities in certain areas, and one country that has some government standards about what kind of content is appropriate, and then making that fit in the US. So my feeling is, yes, it's possible, but it's possible if you do the same thing that you would do in any kind of a co-production where neither side tries to be heavy-handed with the other side. You sit down as equal partners and you talk about the content and what works for your market, and you try to arrive at something that both sides are happy with, that nobody feels is being steamrolled down them just for other reasons. And that's not easy, but I do think it's possible.
I mean, there have been examples of films that have done well, you know, in China and overseas. Very few examples, in fact. I mean, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is an old example. Recently, there haven't been really any successful Chinese movies that have done well in the US or outside of Asia. Obviously, there are lots of Hollywood films that do well inside China, and Fate and the Furious is a recent one, and there are many others. But, you know, our company's business is built on the notion that local audiences prefer to see their own local actors in their own local language. You can take content and have it work in various different countries if you make separate versions of it and adapt it. And you know, a successful example was a film I put together called Infernal Affairs, which was remade as The Departed in the US. It was successful in both markets. Global Gate, we have a film from one of our partners. We have 11 consortium partners. They're all big production distribution companies in the key markets around the world. Lionsgate being our partner here in the US. They have a joint venture with Televisa, who is our partner in Mexico. They had a very successful film called Instructions Not Included, did over $100 million in the box office, cost net less than $3 million to make. And we've remade it now in France, where it was a huge hit. You know, if French movies generally don't travel, it's called Demain tout commence, or Two as a Family. And, you know, it was a success in France and in Germany and in Italy and in Spain and the Netherlands and other places as a French movie. You saw in Intouchables, Intouchable was with the same actor, Omar Sy, who was in our film. And that was a French film that, you know, cost $12 million to make and did $340 million around the world. And now it's being remade in the US in a number of different markets. So we remade this Instructions Not Included in France, in Turkey. We're successful, and we're remaking it in China, India, US, Brazil, and a number of other countries. We recently had another film called How to Be a Latin Lover, which is, again, Latino-oriented film, but we're now making, you know, How to Be a French Lover, How to Be an Italian Lover in a number of different countries. So you can take the concept and remake it in other countries. But I think to just take a Chinese film and export, you saw Wolf Warrior 2, which is closing in on $900 million in the box office in China, $30 million film to make. And it's done almost nothing outside, you know, or at least in the US and outside of Asia. So, you know, that just illustrates still how difficult it is. I think as time goes on and production values increase and improve in China and other foreign markets, you know, you will have more films doing better business in the US. But, you know, and that'll be heavily dependent on, you know, the special effects, the look of the film. But it's not there yet. The films haven't been unique enough in their look and feel, or perhaps not even marketed well enough to hit in the US. And, you know, going the other way, of course, there are examples from Hollywood exporting all around the world, but I think the question was more against, this notion of a co-production with China specifically. And Great Wall was a good effort. You have to applaud the effort. It didn't work in the U.S., and there were issues with it. There were issues from the beginning with that story. At least they tried to do something different. Hopefully, as more people try to make these crossover co-productions, that some will start hitting and they'll figure out, the elements that are necessary to make them better.
Paul, would you like to add anything?
I mean, I agree with largely with everything they've said. In our experience, in the feature production world, we definitely have sort of come to the conclusion that trying to isolate, here's this one universal thing that will work everywhere, is a little bit of a white whale. And I think that's proven out in examples like Wolf Warrior 2 or The Mermaid, like do huge business in China, but don't really do much outside of the native territory. The only thing that I would say that seems to be universal is spectacle. Big, huge visual effects kind of movies seem to work on a global basis.
Does star power matter in 2017? Is it? Do you need a big star? Is it relevant? It's an ongoing conversation on whether it's worth it to put a major star that's going to command X dollars in salary into a movie and hope that that's going to be the draw in any territory around the world.
I think it can definitely help, but it isn't a panacea in that I think 5 to 10 or 15 years ago, there was much more of a safety net if you had a big star. I think I'm putting this a little glibly, but if you had a big enough star and you spent $20 to $30 million of theatrical P&A, you could buy yourself a weekend opening, even if the execution of the film wasn't particularly good. And that was part of the power and the value of stars. In addition to the fact that they tend to be great actors, they promote, they have celebrity value. But I think what we're seeing today is, and I don't want to isolate examples, but I think we can all remember a few of them in recent history where a big star in what feels like a pretty big movie with a major distributor spending wide release P&A capital to market and publicize it, if the movie isn't very good, it doesn't really matter because by Friday afternoon, because of social media and Rotten Tomatoes, everyone knows it's not very good and the box office just peters off very fast.
Right.
Which is a little scary.
You guys agree with that?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, stars can help push a film forward, but it can't fix a problematic story. And there are many stories that don't require big stars. And Wolf Warrior didn't have a particularly large star in it. And many other examples of huge successes like Avatar didn't have big marquee stars in it, although there were some very good actors in it that are well known, but it wasn't a star vehicle per se. So stars help, but they're not necessary and they're not a panacea.
And I think if I was a producer and I had a project, I would rather have a star attached to it than not. But I think the other two are correct. It's not the panacea because if the story isn't good, if the promotion isn't good, it doesn't matter. And there are tons of examples of movies that didn't have big stars that went on to become big hits because they hit something with the public. And because of social media, once you hit a chord with the public and people start saying, this is a really good film, then it doesn't matter whether you have a star or not. You've gotten past the first hurdle. But then the film stands on its own 2 feet. Is it good or bad?
So what's really driving acquisitions in the U.S. marketplace and in China? What does the distributor checklist look like? How does that process work? Does it start with a gut instinct that a film will work, and then you talk to your marketing executives and your distribution executives, and you meet and you see, you look at the calendar and see if it can work? I'm assuming we've got content creators from both China and the U.S. in the audience. How does it work both ways? Is one more difficult than the other? Is a more difficult process? What are the factors that distributors are weighing as they're evaluating which films and TV series to acquire and distribute?
So I think that, in terms of China, deals are being cut for film distribution in advance of the release in the US, so there's no benefit from seeing whether it's successful or not. But there is enough experience, among the acquisition executives to know what they think will work. They're going for big, splashy, CGI oriented films with big stars that are easy to market. There still are the quota issues, so there's not that many films that are actually allowed in for distribution. But I think that the big films are getting distributed in China. The distributors are competing and bidding for those films, for those rights, and those who pay the most and who have the best distribution capability are securing the rights for those big, splashy CGI kind of event tentpole films in general. The smaller budget, less well-known cast kind of in the art house films are not really getting much distribution in China. In terms of the streaming platforms and series, they're looking for those long-running series that are different than the everyday standard things. So they are looking for those kind of high-quality, little bit edgy TV series from the US for distribution in China. And most of the series are finding platforms there. And the question is, do you sell to one platform exclusively where they pay you a significant guarantee, or do you go to several different platforms and try to sell it to 7 or 8 of the major platforms there? That's an economic decision. But they're taking very strange and edgy stuff onto the streaming platforms that would not be shown onto the broadcaster. The broadcaster is still taking on very limited numbers of U.S. series. So in terms of going the other way, from China into the U.S., it's hard. You would have thought that more of the big successful movies would have done better here, but those distribution deals are cut up front again, and they're quite often going to the smaller distribution companies who are sort of China or foreign content-focused companies for theatrical distribution. I'm also a senior advisor to Lionsgate. Lionsgate is investing in a number of Chinese films that Lionsgate will distribute, and it remains to be seen how some of those will do, but to give it a go. And I think more and more companies who are investing in Chinese films, talking about the studios, the Hollywood studio, will then start using their muscle to distribute those companies into the US. I had mentioned Crouching Tiger earlier. Of course, that was pushed by the fact that Sony had it and distributed it in the US. Had it been distributed by a much smaller kind of China film-focused distributor, it would have done far less business, one would assume. And but to take that gamble and to use a bullet with your exhibitors in the U.S. and to take a Chinese film and say that's something you're going to put a lot of effort and money behind is a very tough call to make for distributors. And so most of the Chinese films tend to get these smaller distribution platforms into the theaters, and they go on to the Chinese market-oriented streaming platforms. I mean, you can see lots of good Chinese films on Netflix, but and on other platforms in addition to Netflix. But it's not something that has found its way into the mainstream. The DVD business, of course, is going south in a fast way. So that's not really a great option. And there are those TV channels that are aimed at those local audiences, and those people are very interested in those foreign, kinds of content, but there's not a lot of money there yet. So, to try to take a chance and promote the films that the studios are investing in would be presumably the next step that would be necessary for Chinese films to find a bigger platform to reach larger mainstream audiences in the U.S.
Paul?
I mean, I think, putting myself in the position of an acquisition executive, I think the distinction between the two huge markets, I think both sides, it ultimately always boils down to marketability and who's the audience, right? Because there's a wide spectrum of films that you can think about, who's the audience for this and what's the business model for it in terms of distribution. Is it theatrical? Is it straight to VOD is a day and date, and I think you do the best job you can with your marketing and distribution team to optimize value. I think the distinction that I think William was also getting to that's important is in the United States there's a lot more flexibility and opportunity to pick up things that are maybe not the super obvious huge commercial films. There's a vibrant art house opportunity in the United States. There's also more targeted niche opportunities that still have substantial audience sizes, like the Pantaleon release. I say is a great example where and I'm sure it crossed over beyond the Latin audience, but that's a great example of something that did huge business because there was a niche market to at least focus on initially. I think the issue in China is, in addition to whatever sort of taste sensibilities there are, is you have a regulatory framework that constrains how many movies can be released, and so you have to take that into account, and I think that has a dramatic impact on the decision-making framework.
Okay.
And I'll talk a little about getting things into the U.S. I'm going to assume that most people in the audience are not affiliated with the $100, $200 million features, but are more focused on either the smaller independent films or niche television shows. So I'll talk about TV. If you have a project that you want to try to get into TV in the United States, you have to first try to identify potential buyers and look at what they're showing. If they're a cable broadcaster, what kind of product are they showing? And does your product fit into that at all? It would be very, very difficult because for better or for worse, probably for worse, the United States isn't a market that is receptive to subtitled projects on television. We want it can be dubbed, but we're not even that receptive to dubbed programming. We want it in English. And that makes us probably less sophisticated than other countries that have a greater tolerance for that. We're doing a little better with films now where we're more willing to watch dubbed or subtitled films because there's a lot of great product out there. But for TV, it's really hard to sell it to a widely distributed broadcaster, cable or otherwise, unless it's shot in English and unless ideally it would have some name in it or some hook to it that would cause them to really want it. Because the number of outside acquisitions that a lot of these channels are making is smaller because right now we're in a wave where more channels are doing original programming. And that will probably start to die down because there's almost too much original programming to really be feasible. So you really need to focus on the channels. Then if the channels don't work and you want to put it out to one of the streaming services, then there may be some different rules. As William said, you may be able to put it on Netflix to a Chinese service, and then you don't have to do anything. But you can also dub it or subtitle it for release in the US. But if you don't get to Netflix or Amazon or Hulu, then what? Well, they're smaller services, but then the key becomes how do you promote it so that people see it? You can get anything on a service. There are companies out there you can go to that'll put it online and maybe do a tiny bit of marketing, but how do you spend wise marketing money so that you let the public know that your project is out there? That, I think, is very, very important, and many producers don't think about that. They think, okay, I've got a project, it's a TV series, it's a film, it's got a $5 million budget, that's what I need to be able to make the film. So fine. Somebody gives you $5 million, you make your film, now how do you get it out there? Well, unless you've planned at the beginning for a P&A budget, plan to market and promote the film, you're going to fail. So think carefully before you start on a project. If you think you want to sell it into the US, how can you shape it so that it appeals to a buyer who you've targeted? And if you want to put it out there on a streaming platform, how can you plan to promote it so that you generate an audience for your production?
So think carefully, and I'm thinking carefully about the time on our panel, and I want to be cognizant of this. And I want to allow for some questions from the audience because we have about 5 minutes left. So I know it's a broad subject and there's a lot to talk about. Does anybody have any questions for any of our panelists? Yes.
Hi. So I think it was Mr. Goldberg or you who spoke about people being able to just make content now. I think you said they can just make it in their garage. So with technology, with social media and marketing, do you feel that it's creating better content? Is it creating worse content? Is it harder to weed through the good and the bad? And that's for everybody.
Yes, the short, and I'm not trying to be flip about it, but the short answer is yes to all of that. It's creating better content, it's creating worse content. But we don't know what's going to hit something with the audience. I mean, I did work for an internet platform that spent big money on projects with stars and spent moderate money for the equivalent of somebody going into their garage and doing something. And you would think logically that the projects with stars that have much bigger budgets will do better, but that wasn't always the case. There are people, the younger people in the audience here may know of these people, but there are a lot of people out there who I've never heard of who sit in their room at home and play around with makeup who make millions of dollars as YouTube stars. Would you consider that good content, that's better content than Game of Thrones? Everyone can make their own decision. But there are enough people who like that content that they're making it a really viable business. The internet has created a democratization of film. I won't go on more because I don't want to take away, we don't have much time left, but that's my initial answer.
I think that the user-generated content is a good thing because more and more people are able to experiment and experience the process. And filmmakers like Steven Spielberg and J.J. Abrams and many others started as kids making films, with 8mm little cameras on their own, literally homemade films. And that is a great training process.